Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.
Corruption is a major scourge for any society, economy and democratic system, and we in the European Union are not spared from it. Want to know how the EU is fighting it? Stay with us.
Bribery, embezzlement, clientelism, nepotism, patronage, influence peddling. Corruption comes in many forms and ways, and it's as old as the world itself. But that doesn't make it less of a problem.
No, it doesn't, especially because it undermines the stability of institutions and economic growth. It fuels organised crime, weakens the rule of law as well as trust in public institutions, and threatens our democracies.
And European citizens are very concerned about it. According to a July 2023 Eurobarometer survey, over 70% of them think it's widespread in their country, especially in public institutions. But how bad is it really?
The real scale of corruption is difficult to measure. But one thing is sure, there are no corruption-free zones in the EU, although it affects member states in different ways and to different degrees. So how is the EU addressing this problem?
Since the 1990s, countries around the world have joined efforts to address corruption together. This has led to the emergence of international laws and standards adopted by the Council of Europe, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and the United Nations, amongst others.
Mechanisms such as the Council of Europe Group of States Against Corruption have been developed to monitor implementation of these rules. All 27 EU member states are individual members of GRECO, as the group is known, and the EU has observer status.
Now, while fighting corruption is mainly a national competence, the EU has gradually adopted laws and instruments to address this problem, both directly and indirectly. A central one is the Directive on the Fight Against Fraud to the Union's Financial Interests. Approved in 2017, it lists offences against the EU budget, including cases of fraud, active and passive corruption, the misappropriation of funds, and money laundering, amongst others.
But there are more instruments addressing corruption indirectly, such as the directives on public procurement, on the protection of whistleblowers, and against money laundering. And most recently, in May 2023, the Commission presented an anti-corruption package to revamp the current rules and update the EU sanctions toolbox to include corruption, as the European Parliament had called for.
OLAF, the European Anti-Fraud Office, is responsible for detecting and investigating fraud and corruption affecting EU money, and the figures speak for themselves.
In the space of 12 years between 2010 and 2022, OLAF recommended the recovery of almost €8.5 billion to the EU budget and issued over 3,400 recommendations for judicial, financial, disciplinary and administrative action to be taken by national and EU authorities.
The European Public Prosecutor's Office is responsible for conducting criminal investigations and prosecuting cross-border cases of corruption affecting the EU's financial interests. And the EU also developed its own tool for monitoring anti-corruption efforts, the EU Anti-Corruption Report, but it abandoned it after the first edition, a decision which was strongly criticised by the European Parliament and various stakeholders.
Since then, corruption-related issues have been addressed almost exclusively within the rule of law framework, which has numerous shortcomings. Here's Piotr Bakowski from the European Parliamentary Research Service.
Yes, indeed, there was a shift from a comprehensive anti-corruption policy to a rule of law-oriented perspective. And rule of law instruments deal with a broad range of issues and may overlook corruption-related problems. Some of them, like the EU Justice Scoreboard, focus on very specific aspects of corruption. As a result, what we get is a fragmented picture of corruption in the EU.
The EU Justice Scoreboard presents an annual overview of indicators on the efficiency, quality, and independence of justice systems. The 2023 edition gives information on the length of court proceedings in bribery cases, as well as new indicators regarding authorities involved in tackling corruption. The scoreboard feeds into the European semester and the Commission's annual Rule of Law report.
The problem of the annual Rule of Law report, according to academic experts, is that it only signals the problems once they have occurred and makes no suggestions as to how to address them. We spoke to Professor Petra Bart, an academic closely following this topic.
The Commission's annual rule of law report is a very soft instrument with no legal consequences whatsoever at the end of the process, however grave rule of law violations have been detected. So it would be crucial that compliance with the Commission's recommendations is followed up, or more, in case of grave and systemic value violations, the report should be automatically channeled into hard procedures, such as, for example, infringement actions or conditionality mechanisms.
Compared to the former EU anti-corruption report, it also fails to provide a full picture of systemic corruption issues across the EU, leaving out crucial areas affected by the misappropriation of EU funds, such as public procurement.
Over the past years, the European Parliament has adopted several resolutions on corruption, addressing, among other things, the impact of COVID-19, as well as systemic challenges to rule of law and deficiencies in the EU's fight against corruption.
And it has not shied away from addressing alleged cases of corruption in its own ranks, calling for additional safeguards against corruption in EU institutions.
Want to know more? Check out Piotr Bakowski's full policy brief on the EPRS website or in our app.
This is a European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.
Thanks for listening.